Greetings one and all, and welcome to the Mystic Mind Analysis. I am the Nightmare Rider, Major Mind, reminding you, as always, that even a cheeseburger can be deconstructed to its original source. What I'm going to talk about today is a topic that has been on my mind for quite some time. This is one guaranteed to ignite controversy. Because of this, I am stepping up to provide a balanced critique where few exist beyond pointless ridicule. And so, ladies, NBs and gentlemen, Anita Sarkeesian. Whoa, slow down there, angry mob stock footage representing the audience's reaction. Everyone and their mother goes on about how awful Anita Sarkeesian is. It is so popular to hate her, turning her into this evil gamer-hating villain, that videos trying to prove her wrong have practically become their own subgenre on YouTube. Yet so few critics even try to give her ideas fair consideration, relying on stereotypes, half-truths, and even outright distortions of what she is actually saying. And so, I want to be the one person to try and change that. Now, before I continue, I will say that at the end of this video, I will be establishing some ground rules for the comments section so we can all avoid wasting time for pointless insults and the same old debunked arguments over and over again. But for now, let's take a look at the newest video by Feminist Frequency entitled Strategic Butt Coverage.
If you want to get to know a character, learn about their interests, goals, or desires, their butt is probably not going to give you that information. It won't tell you much about who they are or what they're thinking or feeling at any given time. But video game designers often choose to put tremendous focus on the butts of certain characters while going to almost absurd lengths to avoid calling attention to the butts of others. These carefully crafted choices developers make about camera angles and clothing significantly impact how players think about and relate to these characters.
Anita has done well to establish the opening premise of her argument, talking about contrasting character designs and animations between male and female models in video games. I should note that the use of the word impact may not have been the best choice, but it gets the point across about how characters are framed. We all know the stereotypes about villains from classic cartoons: Dick Dastardly, Skeletor, the Joker. All of these are instantly recognisable as villains because of how the choices of their design reflect their exaggerated personalities. Likewise, when female characters are frequently designed to be overtly showing off skin in sexy poses and revealing costumes, they are being framed as characters that the viewer is supposed to find sexually appealing. This is only one piece of the concept that is objectification, so please check out the sources in the video descriptions to elaborate further.
Third-person games with female protagonists typically display those characters in a way that gives players a full-body view. A classic example of this is the original Tomb Raider games, which are presented from a third-person perspective wherein protagonist Lara Croft's entire body is visible. In these early Tomb Raider games, Lara's butt is typically right in the center of the screen, a camera orientation which, along with the sexualized clothing the designers choose to outfit her in, places a tremendous amount of emphasis on that part of her body.
This does feel like quite a stretch for me. After all, in third-person games that require you to do a lot of platforming, it would help to be able to see a full character in the centre of the screen so that it's easy to see where you're going. While this can vary depending on the genre and style of gameplay, Crash Bandicoot has similarities in its third-person gameplay to Tomb Raider, with the character close to the centre of the screen. Yet no one would call this sexualised purely based on this one factor. With that said, I should make it clear how Anita is specifying that this is a combination of the centre screen framing and sexualised clothing which can direct the player's gaze to Lara's butt. Let's continue and see how Anita specifies further.
In dozens of third-person games with playable female characters, the character's butt is brought to the forefront, and that's where the player's focus is directed. In Batman Arkham City, for instance, the player's gaze is drawn to Catwoman's behind, which is emphasized by her costume and exaggerated hip sway.
Now, this is a much better example of what Anita is trying to illustrate. It is when the features and movements of a female character are exaggerated to make great emphasis on female characters' butts that illustrates the subtext of bodies of female characters being treated as objects. So far, so good. Let's see what she has to say next.
The ceremony! The Sisterhood will never forgive me if I am late.
Golden Axe Beast Rider makes extremely sure that we notice the protagonist's butt just before we take control and start playing. And here in Tomb Raider Underworld, to say that Lara's butt is being emphasized would be putting it mildly.
Incredible. The carvings are clearly similar to early Germanic designs. This is far older than the 5th century.
And this happens all too
You
often.
can't miss it.
While there is an instance where there appears to be player-controlled footage in order to look at Lara's butt, it is pretty evident how the cutscenes move the camera around to make the butts of each character a focus point of the design. Small note, while many will try to debunk one or two examples Anita gives, what Anita is doing with all these clips is pointing out a negative trend that comes up very frequently. Exceptions to the rule do not make the rule false.
Let's contrast the way that women's butts are emphasized with the sometimes absurd lengths taken to cover up or hide men's butts. If some of this footage looks jerky, that's because in some games, trying to get a glimpse of male characters' butts can feel a bit like wrestling with the camera. Common ways men's butts are hidden are by preventing the player from seeing below the character's waistline, or employing a more over-the-shoulder camera angle, which has the added benefit of keeping the character's butt safely out of the frame. The most amusing solution is to simply include a cape, tunic, long coat, or very conveniently positioned piece of tattered fabric, which actively prevents the player from getting a clear or sustained look at the protagonist's butt.
This is another case where I'm half and half on Anita's point. While a clever auto camera zoom that immediately stops you from looking at male characters' butt is rather absurd, the mechanics of over-the-show cameras in third-person shooters are intended likely more for practicality of aiming rather than deliberate butt avoidance. So these examples aren't really very good at illustrating a double standard of avoidance.
For the purposes of this video, I tried to get a glimpse of Batman's rear end, but it's as if his cape is a high-tech piece of Wayne Industries equipment designed to cover up his butt at all costs.
Same as before, I see what she's getting at when the capes deliberately always cover the butt, no matter what the physics are in play for the character model. But it also doesn't strike me as particularly obvious, as Anita makes it out to be, that these capes and long coats are a design choice deliberately made to avoid seeing butts, rather than thematically appropriate design for the kind of story that game developers want to illustrate. The long cape has always been a staple of Batman's design, but it is fair how the mechanics of said cape make it impossible to ever see Batman's butt, while Catwoman is the complete opposite. While Catwoman's costume is similar to past incarnations, this is one of the more obviously sexualized variations due to the cleavage and the aforementioned tightness and exaggerated hip sway.
I like to jokingly refer to this aspect of a male character's costume as the strategic butt covering. Of course, not all games with male protagonists keep the character's butt obscured or out of frame like these games do. The real issue is one of emphasis and definition. A significant portion of third-person games with female protagonists call attention to those characters' butts in a way that's meant to be sexually appealing to the presumed straight male player. In this regard, the way that women's bodies are depicted is significantly different from the way that men's bodies are depicted.
Now this is where Anita really drives the point home, and so is also a clip I suspect many of her most adamant critics will likely completely ignore. Anita is not saying all of these examples are absolute, and it is not about whether or not you can see characters' butt that is the problem. The problem is a matter of emphasis and extra effort made to make the butt stand out for what the developers assume is the primary demographic of straight cis men. And just to preemptively address a common argument made against that last point, considering how few games and developers even acknowledge that there are more sexualities beyond heterosexual, I find it very unlikely that the game developers give even a passing thought to what they think gay men will enjoy.
There are a few examples of male protagonists who are wearing clothing that calls attention to their butts, but for the most part, men's butts, even when visible in the frame, are de-emphasized. Plenty of male heroes wear baggy pants or jeans, Uncharted's Nathan Drake among them, but nothing about his visual design or the jeans he's wearing encourages you to focus on his butt as some sort of defining aspect of his character.
Another big plus for Anita, establish how there are always exceptions to the rule. I was a little iffy on Nathan Drake as one example, but in contrast to many examples we have seen so far, it does seem pretty evident that any emphasis on making male characters' butts stand out is not a regular focus point of the design.
By contrast, this emphasis on the butts of female characters communicates to players that this is what's important. This is what you should be paying attention to. It communicates that the character is a sexual object designed for players to look at and enjoy. And by explicitly encouraging you to ogle and objectify the character, the game is implicitly discouraging you from identifying directly with her. Strategic butt coverings and camera angles that obscure characters' rear ends are not an accident. They are a conscious decision made with great care, and the flip side of this is that designers often do the opposite when the protagonist is female.
I think Amita made a few too many flat statements in this, making it sound like butts alone are going to disassociate the players from actual personality of the character. I think there is a lot more to it than that, including dialogue, roles in the story, and so on, many of which Anita has talked about in previous videos. As I said before, this is not the smoking gun of objectification, rather it is just one of many examples that build on a negative trend of female representation.
This difference in how male and female characters are framed often extends into the advertisements and box covers. Women's butts are front and center, and it's even become a depressing joke that their bodies are twisted and contorted in uncomfortable or unnatural ways so that their breasts and butt can be visible in the same shot.
This is a phenomenon referred to jokingly as Escher girls. For more of these terrible examples of anatomy, visit the Tumblr link in the description below.
In contrast, when men are depicted from behind, there's great effort taken to cover up their rear end, often with other images or shadows. Of course, female characters can also be framed in ways that aren't objectifying. A good example of this is the episodic adventure game Life is Strange, in which the protagonist's butt isn't emphasized or centralized. The camera angles work in conjunction with the story to encourage us to identify with her as a human being. Sadly, the box art for the third-person action-adventure game Beyond Good and Evil emphasizes and sexualizes Jade's butt. The game itself, however, demonstrates that the Nathan Drake approach of outfitting a character in clothing that doesn't emphasize their butt, and not having the camera center it or focus on it, can work just as well to humanize female characters as it does for male characters. So to be clear, the solution here is not to simply show more butts of male characters. Equal opportunity butt display is definitely not the answer. Rather, the solution is to de-emphasize the rear ends of female characters so that players are encouraged not to ogle and objectify these women, but to identify and empathize with them as people. This is not an impossible task, given that game designers do this all the time with their male characters. It's time they started consistently doing it with their female characters too.
I seriously think Anita is improving on her presentation as the videos go on. This formula where she contrasts positive examples to better illustrate her point not only gives shoutouts to the games that put more effort into treating the bodies of female characters as people instead of objects, but also further shows how ridiculous and unnecessary the objectification is. And that concludes the Feminist Frequency video on strategic butt coverage. Overall, a much better and well-refined video that gives a good range of examples to make her point more specific on the topic. While I think the odd example she brings up still can be tenuous, as well as the occasional misplaced word choice that could lead to framing the sentence in a different manner to what was intended, these are relatively few errors for someone who is treated as being absolutely wrong 100% of the time. Depending on how well this video is received, I may do more balanced critiques on Feminist Frequency videos, mostly on the newer ones that come out to give a bigger contrast to the specific terrible responses she gets. Before I conclude this video, I want to set 3 clear ground rules for any discussion that people want to have in the comments. I'll be setting these comments to approval only so that I can weed out those who want to cause trouble. Rule number 1. No harassment. I will not tolerate any gendered insults, calling Anita a professional victim, or anything that attacks her as an individual instead of critiquing her ideas. This goes for the I'm not sexist but attitudes too. If you're going to insist on saying I'm not sexist but, cut out the but and leave it there. Rule number 2. Stay on topic. Do not try and derail the discussions of Anita's arguments with nonsense about her being a scam artist or any ridiculous claims about how she wants to censor video games, oh my. If you cannot talk about the video itself and only ever insist on comparing her to Jack Thompson, you have no place here. Rule number 3. Keep all discussions civil. This goes for all commenters as well. By all means, voice a dissenting opinion and provide opposing arguments to anything that another person has stated. but please do so politely. Again, just like with Anita herself, discuss the arguments instead of trying to insult, mock, or generally make the opposing commenter feel like they aren't worthy of holding any credibility in their statements. With that said, I look forward to seeing what people have to say about this little critique of mine. Until the next time, this is the Nightmare Rider, Mage of Mind, riding out.